So, when I plugged my laptop in today, I got an error message pop up on PowerPoint saying that the fonts aren't available, so I have no idea what the future slides are going to look like. So, hi everyone, it's a pleasure here to be talking today. It's my first time at B-Sides Leeds. So, my name is Isaac Potts, and I'm a penetration tester at KPMG. So, a bit of background to myself. I got into pen testing through Tetris. In high school, I absolutely loved Tetris. And halfway through one of the years, the high school blocked Tetris. I was really sad. So I figured out a way to bypass the blocker they used. Then they patched the bypass I used. Then I found a way past that. And it went on like that for the rest of my few years at school. I then got into Try Hack Me, and from there started learning to code on HackerBox, and I went to Abertay University. During university, I spent a lot of time on HackerBox doing their pen tester pathway, working and partying. I graduated last year after I was offered a job, and since then I've done an array of pen testing at KPMG. I'm by no means a graphic designer, so there is a lot of stock images in these slides. So a bit of background to this talk. I love CTFs, and I've made quite a few of them, from forensics and steganography challenges to full pwn challenges at Abertay's Ethical Hacking Society. And a huge part of the reason I'm in front of you presenting today. And during university, I had a few cyber jobs, and I've lost my mouse. 1 second. Thank you very much. And spent a lot of time working towards certifications, which I never ended up getting, but I learned a lot, and doing CTFs. And when I actually started pen testing, there was quite a big difference between the type of hacking I'd done for CTFs in university and the hacking I do in pen testing. And this was both a technical difference and a difference in the way they were approached. I did a talk at Security up at Dundee earlier this year about a lot of the technical bits, but that didn't hit the mark for how I really found the transition, and I focused way too much on the technical aspects and not what I thought could actually help someone be better at pen testing. So I wanted to do a talk on what actually translated, what didn't, and how to prepare for pen testing, and not just CTFs. And I wanted to do this talk to explain how to help with the challenges I found, and still find transitioning between the two. So most of what I do on my job is web app pen testing, with bits of experience in infrastructure and cloud testing, alongside some OSINT, phishing, and purple team stuff. So let's start off with definitions. So, HackerBox defines CTFs as gamified competitive cybersecurity events that are based on different challenges or aspects of information security. The NCSC defines penetration testing as a method for gaining assurance in the security of an IT system by attempting to breach some or all of the system security using the same tools and techniques as an adversary might. So there's some positives and negatives to CTFs that I want to talk about today. So in short, CTFs teach you the technical bits of pen testing and different techniques to exploit systems and applications. But they teach you how to exploit vulnerabilities that are to compromise the system, and not vulnerabilities that require user interaction or help improve the overall security posture of a system or application. And that's kind of what I want to address, is how to learn those, along with some other ramblings about tunnel vision, imposter syndrome, and my advice on overcoming those. So most CTFs are designed to learn techniques used in pen testing. And to do that, the CTF needs to be vulnerable. And going into a CTF, you will always know that it is vulnerable. And this could range from something like remote code execution in a very obvious input box to with full pseudo privileges or convoluted attack chain to gain access to a low-level account. And from there, you need to perform horizontal or vertical privilege escalation to access a high-privileged user, and that's a CTF. So I'm aware I've generalized a heck of a lot there, and some CTFs do break out of this mold, but a lot of them do follow similar paths. Sometimes with more complex layers, like a Windows machine using WSL, or a machine with Docker containers to move through and eventually break out of. And now we get to see where the fonts died. The point of me saying that is CTFs are intentionally vulnerable and take logical next steps to compromise an account, then eventually the entire machine. So going into a pen test with the mindset of something taking logical next steps will always result in tunnel vision, where you've seen one misconfiguration hundreds and hundreds of times before, and it always follows on to the next logical steps. And pen tests don't really work like that. To escalate privileges in a web app, I have literally found a privilege escalation button on a pen test where I could assign myself global admin privileges as a low-level user. Or a Linux machine that every user has full sudo permissions on. And it can be hard to know what to look at when finding that, as other privilege escalation could just seem a bit pointless. So with a CTF being assumed vulnerable, after doing a few of around the same difficulty, you can kind of just guess what to do, put special characters in input boxes, On websites, check for DNS zone transfer, look for parameters to support local file inclusion, code reversible users, yada yada yada. Now the thing here is that all of this values speed. Like, you could automate all of the checks and go get coffee while those run. And that's what AI is really useful for. And you eventually develop a kind of sixth sense about CTFs, with what to look for and where to look for them. And that does kind of translate into pen testing. And playing CTFs is a really great way to hone that and learn to spot vulnerabilities as much by instinct as anything else. But pen testing, on the flip side, is also about understanding the purpose of what you are testing and what could pose a risk to it. And while some quick checks, like watch-swapping CTFs, may reveal some low-hanging fruit, it doesn't really yield any information further into the application or system or find a lot of vulnerabilities that actually affect it. But on pen testing, there could be a number of issues missed, while they aren't something to give remote code execution, they still give some sort of impact within the context of the application, or could have a result later down the line. Pen testing is about looking at how to defend a web app or system from any avenue of attack, rather than just looking to get access to the system. A good example of this is something requiring user interaction, such as an open redirect in a web app. If you try to browse to an authenticated page in a web app, it should redirect you to the login screen, and sometimes add a parameter to the URL that once you successfully log in, will send you to the page you tried to browse to. Changing this URL to something else, like a website you control, would redirect a user to whatever website you specify in a valid login. So, where it doesn't usually matter when a CTF is vulnerable to something requiring user interaction, like this, you could try and phish a user, but it can and does cause a real impact in systems. Personally, I found the switch from CTF to pentest hard, and I still do. When I spent a weekend making or doing CTFs, it's tricky to jump straight into a pentest on Monday. And personally, this kind of stems from how I set goals and how I approach both. And this is because if you don't find some cool vulnerabilities, or sometimes any vulnerabilities in a pentest, it can quite frankly feel like you're failing the pentest. While the reality of it is where your goals are set. If your goals are set on accessing the underlying system, finding a way to access the restricted bits of the app, or some other privilege escalation, the chances you are going to be disappointed on the first day. Like, I very rarely even get access to the system on my first day of testing. So where I set my goals with pen testing is if I can find something interesting. Even if that's just an interesting header that makes the web app do something funky. My goal should probably be following a methodology correctly, but that's not as fun. And by interesting, I mean something I haven't seen before or implemented in a new way. Like, on one test I was doing, I was using a burp extension called param miner, and there's a weird header that let me redirect myself to a part of the application of my choice. Well, it's not really exploitable, still interesting. And on another, it was finding an Active Directory certificate services exploit, which was very interesting and very exploitable. In the wild, on another, it was like building an attack path which went from an IDOR to sending malicious files to other users in an application, which I'll talk about later. What I'm trying to say here is that a small mindset change, like where your goals are, can help with anxiety and imposter syndrome in testing, which are both something I experience quite a lot. So, setting goals can also help with tunnel vision. I get this a lot, where I see something that gives me an odd response, or I think something is misconfigured, and I can't focus on anything but that. Or if I find one exploit that usually leads onto another in CTFs, and it doesn't have this natural escalation, I find it hard to look at the avenues of attack and vulnerability does actually open up. An example of this for me is a reflected XSS I found on a login page very early in my career. There was a redirect parameter in the URL where you put JavaScript or HTML in it, and it would execute. Now, you'd look to try and steal cookies, but I couldn't, because the user wasn't logged in. And I spent so damn long trying to make a working keylogger that bypassed their content security policy, that I found myself running out of time to get any sort of evidence and test the rest of the application. And in the very, very first test I did, I found a completely unrestricted file upload. So I was only supposed to be able to upload photos, but I could upload anything from executables to whatever I chose. So in a CTF, the next logical step is usually command execution, or the ability to write to or read files with a file upload. And all of these failed. And again, I spent far too long looking at what I thought and as experience was the next logical step, that it wasn't until near the end of the test I realized that the uploaded file was publicly accessible, and the file was stored in an easily guessable format, which made a not great vulnerability quite a bit worse, as you could distribute or store malware or find any files stored by the company. I also saw a very similar scenario once, where the uploaded files were all stored in an S3 bucket, and I went down the same rabbit hole of like local file inclusion or trying to enumerate AWS information. But I just found that S3 buckets, if you upload HTML files to them, they will serve any HTML files by default. And this is to do with the content type in which they return HTML files. So unless a different content type is set, whatever HTML you upload will execute in the context of a victim's browser, even if the S3 bucket is not actually configured to do so. So this would allow you to essentially phish other users. It's on a different domain than the standard website, so I couldn't steal cookies or anything else fun. But again, I was so focused on trying to get like local file inclusion or something else that I nearly didn't notice that glaring issue. And sometimes you want something to be harder to achieve than it actually is. So, I went on a bit of a tangent there, and all of those are examples of tunnel vision and how it negatively affected me. And it's quite hard to get over and stop focusing on. But one thing that usually helps me is a timer. So I usually have a really broad scope of work to cover. So when I find something interesting, I give myself half-hour time to see what I can do with it. And after that half hour, I go, look at something else, I'll take a break, and if I have time later, I come back to it. And it helps me get some perspective and see the whole picture of what I'm doing, what I'm trying to test, and what I'm actually trying to exploit. And what also works for me is a checklist of everything I should be doing and looking for. And that kind of resets something in my brain, so rather than focusing on one thing for hours, I'll look at a bunch of issues and actually give the client a much better penetration test. So, when I first started testing, I didn't really find anything with a lot of the payloads that you usually use in CTF, like SQL 1 equals 1 or like a normal XSS payload. And I was quite quickly proved wrong. So when I went and did the training course for the CSTM exam, we learned a bunch of payloads, how they worked, why they worked, and what would stop them from working. And I was pretty convinced I wasn't really going to find anywhere vulnerable to those payloads. Literally a week later, I found affected XSS in a URL parameter with one exact payload they taught, which I showed in an earlier slide. So a bit of advice I'll give is understand what the payload is doing and not how simple it looks. Another way of understanding payloads is to find what works and then understand how it works. And that's what CTFs are really, really great for. And a big thing in cybersecurity as a whole for a lot of people is imposter syndrome. A friend of mine called Sam McDonald does a fantastic talk on it, and it affects pretty much everyone. Most people you speak to don't believe they're qualified for a job. A good enough pen tester to find or exploit some vulnerabilities, or just they lied their way into a job. And I felt all of those before. And this can happen from the realization that being good at CTFs doesn't always translate to pen testing. And that's what happened to me when I realized I had to change my perspective to be able to pen test. I have a friend, Luke, who helped me write this talk, say that if you... I've lost where I am now, sorry. I have a friend who helped me write this talk, say to me that if you don't experience imposter syndrome, you don't have an appreciation of the implications of pen testing. And I do partially agree with that, but there is a point where it can become debilitating. And it's something that I don't necessarily know how to get over. And there's no one-size-fits-all solution for everyone. But what works for me is just doing something, as the keynote said very well. I've been told many times by multiple different people to ask for forgiveness and not permission, when my default way of operating and the way I was taught was the exact opposite. Embracing that and making the mistakes I was terrified to make and looking like a fool in front of clients is the only thing that's helped me get over it. Now, I'm going to talk about some attack paths that I've seen that use CTF that use CTF-esque skills, and some that don't. So, this was one found by Aaron. If Aaron can give everyone a wave. I'll sit next to him for the whole exploit process. It was great fun. So, let's take a look at one that quite closely followed a CTF attack path, like Stream.io or Archetype. So, this was one a friend found, Aaron. So, in a web app, you could change the content type of data sent in the body of a post request. And when you did, the application sends an error message containing the connection string to the database in use. So that's pretty bad, right? And not something you'd expect to see in a real application. And you can see the request sent containing XML on the slide here. And you can see the response here. So with that username and password, you could connect to the database, do some basic enumeration, and find out how there's some sensitive data. And you could also find it was an MS SQL database, and that XP CMD shell was enabled. So this lets you execute any command on the server as the MS SQL service account. Then, looking at the privileges, the service account had the C impersonate privilege, which can allow escalation to system and compromise the entire machine. So that's pretty damn cool, and seems a lot like some CTFs that I've done. Now, the formatting on the next slide has really messed up. So, taking a look at a different one. This is purely web app based. So to set some background, this is an app with multiple different user levels with a chat functionality that uses WebSockets. In the page to view what messages you had, you could change an identifier in the URL, like changing a 1 to a 2 in the web app, and this reveals absolutely nothing. But if you did the same in the corresponding API, there was no access controls, so changing the identifier in the URL in the API, you could retrieve some information of another user. But you could also find the conversation ID, which was a UUID, which was used to view messages. Now, in the WebSockets bit, you could open a socket as any user on the application, and not just those who were supposed to be able to open a WebSocket. And using the retrieved conversation ID, you could read to, edit, and write to all conversations on the web app, and this included being able to upload files. Now, as this vulnerability relied on having multiple user accounts on multiple user levels in the application to just discover the vulnerability, it's not something I've seen in a CTF before. Something like this is rare to find, but the individual components of it are quite common. So it's about being able to see the bigger picture of what you can do in an application with a few different weird misconfigurations and not just one vulnerability. So then, the question is how to get better at this outside of a job. And that can be a bit tricky to do. And there are labs on Portsmouth and Hackbox Academy that work. But what actually just really helped me is coding something vulnerable. So if I was interested in how WebSockets work, or wanted to learn about access controls, I'd make something like that. And this also teaches you how to remediate, but a bit more on that later. Sorry about the formatting again. And pen tests are not structured like a CTF. You start off with user accounts, sometimes high privileged, and the goal isn't always, can I escalate my privileges? It's landing on a Linux server and seeing all user accounts have full sudo permissions with no password and going, I wonder why. Is this actually needed, or was someone just being super lazy when they set it up? And at that point, you need to look at how to enumerate a system with full root or administrator privileges and assess the impact of vulnerabilities of what you can prove and beyond what you can see, as you're putting yourself in the shoes of a threat actor who wouldn't really stop at just trying to compromise one machine. So this is looking in the root folder, seeing if you can find passwords to access different services on different servers. Finding long-lived AWS access keys, which let me access and enumerate a completely different AWS account than the account that the server was in. Or in any scenario where you're a high-privileged user, you should look at attack paths that other users could use to access the same level of user as you're at, and what you can access at that level. So in a CTF, you get domain admin or system and done. The pen test shouldn't stop there. Running Bloodhound limpies or manually looking for other attack paths as a high-privileged user can show attack paths that you've completely missed. And even as a high-privileged user, it's important to look at what an attacker could access remotely. And this brings me on to context. The context is just as important as the actual vulnerability. Using the example above of all users having full sudo privileges, I found only a few people actually needed to access the system set up and configure it correctly which sudo privileges were needed to do so. So then it becomes more of a question of looking at how access is controlled in the initial setup and what happens after it's set up. So making sure that the principle of least privilege is obeyed with access, and once it's set up, if people won't actually need sudo access to it, then access should be just limited to specific binaries, and there should always be a password set on the sudo user. On any user running sudo, And it takes a lot of context to be able to determine the severity for a vulnerability. For example, take an IDOR. Changing a 1 to a 2 in a URL to access another user's information is usually pretty bad. But it's about seeing what other things can the user access. So rather than just trying to affect the confidentiality of the application, like seeing the user's address, can you affect the integrity of the data as well by changing a user's password or email address or changing other data that only that user should be able to change? And thinking of the risk of something and what you could do with that and demonstrating that to a client is a huge part of being a pen tester that isn't really highlighted by a CTF. And the context of risk is something that's hard to define and can be very application, system, or even client dependent. Which brings me on to how to actually get better at quantifying risk. And as I just said, it's hard to do in the context of a CTF, as you don't have access to multiple user accounts, and the system doesn't have any real features. And you can't just ask a client what something is used for, or if sudo permissions on all user accounts are actually needed. So to get better at it, for vulnerabilities you discover in CTFs, write remediation, and just try to judge a vulnerability to the best of your ability. CVSS score it, and talk to someone about it, or, like I do, just explain it to an inanimate object. I write up most of my CTFs and have started including remediation of vulnerabilities, and it really helps. This leads me on to gathering proof of concepts for vulnerability. A proof of concept is just something that shows a client the danger of what a vulnerability can do. Like with XSS, showing a client an alert box with the URL in it doesn't show what XSS can actually do, opposed to showing them a payload that bypasses their CSP and will steal a user's cookie, resulting in a full account takeover. To learn about proof of concepts, have a look at bug bounty reports, vulnerability write-ups for open source projects, and when you find a vulnerability, you need to show how far you can take it, not just show that it exists, as a client might ask to reduce the severity, and you need to be able to defend your reasoning. I'm going to skip over the next slide, it's just me ranting about cloud stuff. And CTFs don't have consequences, and don't teach them. And this is something that, when I started testing, made me feel a lot more cautious and anxious about my work. Is that I was testing a real client system. And in doing so, I had the ability to inadvertently take down a site. And luckily for me, this hasn't happened yet, but it did during my CSDN exam. And if I did something like that during a pen test, that would have hurt my ability to do the test, resulted in a lot of things, and that actually made me so much more nervous to actually try exploits. Then, how do you get past that? For me, as the same with imposter syndrome, is to just dive right into something. Try exploiting something and talk to the client and get their permission. If the exploit fails or damages something on the server, it's usually not the end of the world. Or at least that's what I tell myself after last week. Obviously not included denial of service vulnerabilities here, but our job is to quantify the risk of something to a client, and we can't always do that by being cautious, as the work we do helps prevent something worse happening by a threat actor further down the line. Now getting on to my greatest weakness in CTFs, and a bit with pen testing. If I'm struggling with the CTF, and I spend a few hours on it, and get nowhere, I nearly always look at a walkthrough. I'm sure many people do the same. So it's okay to look at walkthroughs like when you first start doing CTFs, but it's important to see the point where they become a crutch to your learning. And for me, it becomes a crutch when I look at walkthroughs before I've tried simple things, like missing an SMB null session. And how to get past that is something I suck at in real life too, which is taking breaks. I'll take a break and go for a walk occasionally when I'm stuck on a pen test, and if I come back with new ideas on new things to try. And this works for CTFs too. I used to say that I'll spend an hour on a CTF. If I can't figure anything out, I'll look at a walkthrough. Now I spend so much longer on a CTF, as I really learn and remember things by banging my head against the wall. And you can get better at remediation and cloud-related vulnerabilities by actually setting something up, whether that's following a guide to set up a website in AWS, or just setting up your own Ubuntu server and configuring it with some vulnerabilities you find interesting. Now, there aren't a huge amount of resources for actually making a CTF or making something vulnerable. And this is what I found AI really useful for, is quickly gathering how to make something vulnerable to a specific vulnerability and gathering sources and proof of concepts related to it. Just remember, when you set something up, use virtualization software. I've nearly bricked my PC so many times. And trying to make a vulnerability, like something simple like NFS in the root directory running as root, or the ability to SSH into a machine as the root user, requires a bit of unique setup. And creating a simple misconfiguration like that builds a really good baseline for understanding the more complex ones. Nowadays, when I encounter an unfamiliar technology and I have time, I set it up to understand common attack paths and misconfigurations. And this leads me on to something else. Pen testing, as most jobs in cyber and many other industries, is a high-pressure job. And it's different from doing CTFs every day, as there's a lot more involved in it than just hacking. And just the technical side. You're expected to know a lot about many different subject areas. While so much of the job is just being curious and being able to Google something effectively, it can be long hours, and sometimes it can be hard to deal with difficult clients or access issues. But it is an awesome job that is quite different from just doing CTFs for fun. Doing pen testing day in and day out is genuinely the most fun job I have ever had. As long as you take breaks, take holiday when you need it, and be able to step away and enjoy other things. If that's a hobby, like going to conferences and babbling about CTFs for half an hour, drawing, writing, archery, or playing D&D. It's super important you are able to do that, and ultimately makes you a much better pen tester, as you always come back with new ideas, and you don't get burnt out. As I say that, as my own limits were never ever reached with doing CTFs, but they have been with pen testing before. To summarise, making something vulnerable, exploiting it, and fixing it is the best way to learn how exploits work, and the best way to get better at explaining fixes to a client. And if you want some motivation for making CTFs, Hack the Box pay pretty damn well for CTFs. I would like to say a huge thank you to Luke Jones for helping me write this talk and his partner for making the slides look better, and a thank you to Evan for the attack chain. I'll take any questions and try my best to answer them now, and feel free to ask any questions one-on-one after this, as I hated asking questions in front of a crowd, and I'm just crossing my fingers I'm a little bit better at answering them.
Would you rather your questions outside afterwards?
Pardon? Yes. I'm happy with either, to be honest, but yeah.
No, that's fine. So, any quick questions before we let the next speaker get themselves set up? There is also, just as a heads up, there is an AMA desk downstairs in reception. If anyone has any questions, literally there are no questions off bounds. There's people on the table for the entire day if people have any random things they want to talk about from careers, advice or anything like that. Is it a question for the AMA or a question for us?
Did CTF skills also help you with your pentest job interview, or is that a bit different?
Absolutely, yeah. So we had a technical interview, and that played a very, the stuff I learned from doing CTFs played a really huge part in that. Let me be able to exploit the system and be able to write a report on it. And yeah, so they really did help me get the job.
Anyone else have any questions? Obviously, Isaac, you're going to be here for the day.
I'm going to be here for the day.
Cool. Right. Thanks very much, everyone. And